At its peak in the 1950s, the United States operated more than 500 state psychiatric hospitals, housing more than 500,000 patients on any given day, many of them in sprawling campuses built to look less like hospitals and more like self-contained small cities, with their own farms, power plants, chapels, and cemeteries. Then, over roughly 3 decades, almost all of them emptied out. New medications, new civil rights lawsuits, and a fundamental shift in how the country thought about mental illness combined to close hospital after hospital, sometimes with only a few years of warning, sometimes with almost none. What they left behind were buildings, enormous, ornate, in many cases architecturally significant buildings, built to house thousands of people, standing empty across the country, in various states of collapse and preservation, most of them still there today because tearing down a building that size costs more money than most towns and counties actually have. This video counts down 10 of those buildings, real hospitals with real patients, whose stories are documented in state health department archives, court records, and investigative journalism. Some of these hospitals are still standing, some have been partially demolished. All of them tell a piece of the same story: what happens when a country decides, all at once, that it no longer wants to run the institutions it spent a century building. Stay with me to the end, because the final hospital on this list was the site of one of the most important vaccine trials in American history, testing on children who had no ability to consent to it. Let's begin. Danvers State Hospital, in Massachusetts, opened in 1878 as one of the most architecturally ambitious psychiatric hospitals ever built in the United States. Its design followed what was known as the Kirkbride Plan, a model developed by psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride that called for long, staggered wings extending outward from a central administration building, arranged specifically to maximize the amount of sunlight and fresh air reaching every patient ward. A design philosophy rooted in the belief that the physical environment itself could contribute to a patient's recovery. At its peak population in the 1930s, Danvers housed more than 2,300 patients, nearly double its intended capacity, a level of overcrowding that mirrored what was happening at state hospitals across the entire country during the same period. Overcrowding brought understaffing, and understaffing brought conditions that later investigations and patient accounts described as inadequate at best. Danvers was also, for a period, a site where prefrontal lobotomies were performed, a procedure that was considered a legitimate psychiatric treatment for a period of decades before falling into disrepute as its long-term effects on patients became better understood. As the deinstitutionalization movement gained momentum through the 1960s and 1970s, Danvers' population declined steadily, and the hospital finally closed in 1992. Most of the massive original Kirkbride building was demolished in 2007 to make way for a residential development, though the demolition preserved and incorporated the hospital's dramatic central administration tower into the new construction, a striking case of a building's most recognizable feature surviving inside a structure built for an entirely different purpose. What remains today is a strange hybrid, modern apartments built around the architectural skeleton of a 19th-century asylum, a building that spent more than a century as an institution and now spends its afterlife as someone's home. Pennhurst State School and Hospital, in eastern Pennsylvania, was built in 1908 not as a psychiatric hospital in the traditional sense, but as an institution for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, admitting both children and adults who were, in many cases, committed by their own families with little other support available to them. At its peak, Pennhurst housed more than 3,500 residents across a campus of dozens of buildings, and for decades it operated with relatively little outside scrutiny of what actually happened inside its walls. That changed in 1968, when a local television reporter gained access to the facility and produced a documentary that showed, in unflinching detail, residents living in overcrowded wards, receiving inadequate care, and in some documented cases suffering physical abuse from insufficiently trained and supervised staff. The broadcast, titled "Suffer the Little Children," generated national outrage and became a pivotal moment in the broader disability rights movement, directly contributing to a landmark 1977 federal court case, Halderman v. Cum, Pennhurst State School and Hospital, in which a federal judge ruled that residents had a constitutional right to treatment in the least restrictive setting possible, rather than warehousing in an institution. The Pennhurst case became one of the foundational legal precedents behind the broader deinstitutionalization movement for people with developmental disabilities nationwide, and Pennhurst itself closed in 1987. Much of the campus stands empty today, its decaying wards a physical reminder of a legal case that changed how the entire country treats people with disabilities, though in a strange turn, portions of the site have since been operated seasonally as a haunted attraction, a use that disability rights advocates have criticized as trivializing a place where documented serious harm occurred to real people. Before we continue, it's worth understanding something that connects almost every hospital on this list, because it changes how you should think about the rest of this video. These closures were not, for the most part, driven primarily by a sudden concern for patient welfare. Even though welfare concerns like the ones at Pennhurst absolutely played a role in specific, high-profile cases, the larger force behind deinstitutionalization was economic and pharmacological. The introduction of antipsychotic medications like Thorazine in the 1950s made it possible, for the first time, to manage many patients' symptoms without permanent hospitalization. State governments, looking at the enormous cost of maintaining sprawling hospital campuses, saw an opportunity to shift the financial burden of mental health care from state institutions to community mental health centers, federal disability programs, and in many documented cases, onto families, homeless shelters, and jails that were never designed or funded to take on that responsibility. The result, as multiple academic studies and government reports have documented in the decades since, was a genuine improvement in living conditions for some former patients, and a genuine crisis for others, as the community mental health infrastructure that was supposed to replace the old hospital system was never funded at the scale the closures required. The buildings on this list, in other words, did not close because America solved mental illness. They closed because the country decided a different, cheaper approach was worth trying, and the empty hospitals are what's left of the old approach. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, originally known as Weston State Hospital, sits in Weston, West Virginia, and holds a distinction that separates it from every other building on this list. It is widely cited as the largest hand-cut sandstone building in North America, constructed using stone quarried locally and cut by hand, much of the labor performed by Union soldiers during a construction period that was repeatedly interrupted by the Civil War, since the hospital's building site changed hands between Union and Confederate control multiple times before the war ended. Weston opened in 1864 and was designed like Danvers, according to the Kirkbride Plan, with the same philosophy of maximizing light and air for every patient. Its population, like nearly every state hospital of the era, eventually far exceeded its intended capacity, reaching more than 2,400 patients at its peak against an original design capacity closer to 250, a nearly tenfold overcrowding that made individualized care functionally impossible regardless of the staff's intentions. The hospital operated for more than a century, through the same era of prefrontal lobotomies, insulin shock therapy, and other treatments that later generations of psychiatrists would come to view as harmful, before finally closing in Unlike most of the hospitals on this list, Trans-Allegheny survived largely intact and was purchased by a private buyer in 2007, who has operated it as a historical tour site and seasonally as a haunted attraction, generating both preservation funding and renewed criticism from mental health advocates who argue that using a former patient care facility for entertainment purposes disrespects the people who lived and in many cases died there. If you're finding this history as fascinating as we do, we'd genuinely appreciate it if you hit that like button and consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep telling stories like these. Now let's continue. Traverse City State Hospital in northern Michigan opened in 1885 under the direction of Dr. James Decker Munson, a physician who was, by the standards of his era, a notable reformer, advocating for what was called the cottage plan, which favored smaller, more home-like residential buildings scattered across a campus rather than a single massive institutional structure. Munson also championed work therapy, agricultural labor, and what he considered a more humane, less restrictive approach to patient care than the custodial model common at many state hospitals of the period. Despite Munson's reformist intentions, Traverse City State Hospital, like nearly every institution of its kind, grew far beyond its original design capacity as the 20th century progressed, eventually housing several thousand patients and facing the same overcrowding and understaffing challenges documented at hospitals across the country. The facility remained in continuous operation for more than a century, finally closing in 1989 as part of the broader statewide deinstitutionalization that affected Michigan's mental health system throughout the 1970s and 1980s. What makes Traverse City unusual among the hospitals on this list is what happened afterward. Rather than sitting abandoned indefinitely or being demolished, a significant portion of the historic campus was redeveloped beginning in the early 2000s into what is now known as the Village at Grand Traverse Commons, a mixed-use development containing shops, restaurants, and residential condominiums built inside the hospital's original brick buildings. Several structures on the broader campus remain unrenovated and closed to the public, existing in a state of active decay just beyond the walls of buildings that have been fully restored, creating a striking contrast between the site's commercial present and its unaddressed past. Fairfield Hills State Hospital in Newtown, Connecticut, opened in 1932 and grew over the following decades into one of the largest psychiatric institutions in New England, eventually comprising more than a dozen major buildings spread across a sprawling campus, including patient wards, an administration building, a chapel, a power plant, and staff housing, functioning as a nearly self-contained community that at its peak housed close to 4,000 patients. The hospital's population declined steadily through the deinstitutionalization era of the 1960s and 1970s, and Fairfield Hills finally closed in 1995. The town of Newtown subsequently purchased the entire campus from the state of Connecticut, and portions of the property have been redeveloped for municipal and community use over the following decades, including athletic fields and municipal offices established in some of the smaller buildings. Several of the larger original ward buildings, however, remain closed and unrenovated, their interiors left largely untouched since the hospital's closure, structurally sound enough to still stand but not maintained to any standard that would allow public entry. The scale of Fairfield Hills' original campus, and the sheer cost of either renovating or demolishing more than a dozen large institutional buildings, has made the site's redevelopment a slow, multi-decade process that continues today, more than 3 decades after the last patients were transferred elsewhere. It stands as one of the clearer examples on this list of just how difficult it is for a small town to absorb and repurpose an institution that was, in its own era, built at a scale entirely disproportionate to the community around it. Manteno State Hospital, in rural Kankakee County, Illinois, opened in 1930 and grew rapidly to become one of the largest psychiatric hospitals in the entire country, housing more than 8,000 patients at its peak population during the 1940s, a scale that made it, for a period, functionally larger than many of the small towns surrounding it. Like other hospitals of its era, Manteno operated its own farm, powered largely by patient labor, a practice defended at the time as therapeutic work, but later criticized as a form of uncompensated labor extracted from a population that had no meaningful ability to refuse. Manteno's closure came later than many comparable institutions, with the hospital finally shutting down in 1985 as Illinois, like most states, moved its remaining psychiatric patients into smaller community-based facilities or, in a pattern documented by mental health researchers across the country, into nursing homes, jails, and homelessness when adequate community placements were not available. Unlike hospitals that sat abandoned for decades, most of Manteno's original buildings were demolished relatively quickly after closure, and the site was redeveloped into an industrial park that today hosts warehouses and distribution centers for major national retailers. A small number of original structures, including the hospital's water tower and a handful of smaller support buildings, survive as isolated remnants scattered across an otherwise thoroughly transformed landscape, easy for anyone driving through the industrial park today to miss entirely unless they already know what they're looking for. Northville Psychiatric Hospital, in the Detroit suburb of Northville, Michigan, opened in 1952, making it considerably younger than most of the other hospitals on this list, built specifically to relieve overcrowding at Michigan's older 19th century state hospitals as the state's population grew rapidly in the post-war era. Despite being purpose-built as a more modern facility, Northville followed the same broader trajectory as its older counterparts, rising patient populations through the 1950s and 1960s, followed by a steady decline as deinstitutionalization policy took hold across Michigan through the 1970s. The hospital officially closed in 2003, and unlike several of the hospitals on this list that found new commercial or residential purposes, Northville's campus was simply left standing, unmaintained and unsecured, for more than a decade afterward. The buildings became a well-known destination for urban explorers throughout the 2000s and 2010s, drawn by the site's proximity to Detroit and the relatively intact condition of its interiors compared to hospitals that had been closed for far longer. That period of extended abandonment ended in stages beginning in the mid-2010s, as the site was gradually demolished to make way for redevelopment, a process that has continued in phases over multiple years. By the time the demolition work concluded, most of Northville's original buildings had been reduced to rubble, closing out a roughly two-decade period during which the hospital existed in the specific limbo that defines so much of this list: too expensive to renovate, too large to quickly demolish, and left standing simply because nobody had yet found a use for what remained. Kings Park Psychiatric Center, on Long Island in New York, opened in 1885 and eventually grew into one of the largest psychiatric hospital campuses in the United States, encompassing more than 150 individual buildings spread across roughly 875 acres, including its own power plant, farm, and even a private railroad spur built specifically to transport coal and supplies onto the grounds. At its peak population in the 1950s, Kings Park housed more than 9,000 patients, a population that, combined with its enormous physical footprint, made it functionally one of the largest institutions of any kind operating anywhere in New York State. The hospital's decline mirrored the broader statewide pattern of deinstitutionalization that affected New York's psychiatric hospital system throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and Kings Park's patient population and operational scope shrank dramatically over those decades before the facility fully closed in 1996. What makes Kings Park distinctive among the hospitals on this list is simply the scale of what was left behind. More than 150 buildings, most of them never demolished, most of them never renovated, sitting across nearly 900 acres of Long Island, a scale of abandonment that has made the site one of the most extensively documented and explored former psychiatric hospitals in the entire country. Portions of the Kings Park property have been converted into a public park in the years since closure, but the majority of the hospital's original buildings remain standing, fenced off, and officially inaccessible, an enormous footprint of unused institutional infrastructure sitting on some of the most valuable real estate in the New York metropolitan area, largely because the cost of fully demolishing or renovating a campus this size has, for nearly 3 decades, exceeded what any single entity has been willing to spend. Letchworth Village in Rockland County, New York, opened in 1911 as an institution for people with intellectual disabilities and epilepsy. Built according to a design philosophy that, like Traverse City's cottage plan, favored smaller residential cottages scattered across a rural campus rather than a single massive institutional building, a design intended at the time to feel less clinical and more like a genuine community. For several decades, Letchworth Village was held up nationally as a model institution, visited by public officials and reformers as an example of humane, progressive care for a population that had historically been treated far worse in older, more custodial facilities. That reputation did not survive contact with what was actually happening inside the institution. Letchworth Village became, in the 1950s, one of the sites where Dr. Jonas Salk conducted early human trials of his polio vaccine, testing it on child residents of the institution, children who, because of their legal status as wards of a state institution, had no meaningful ability to provide informed consent, and whose parents, in many documented cases, had little practical say in the matter either. The trials were conducted with the knowledge and permission of the institution's administration, under research ethics standards that would not survive scrutiny under any modern review board, decades before informed consent protections that are now considered basic became standard practice in American medical research. Letchworth Village's population declined through the deinstitutionalization era, and the facility fully closed in 1996, following investigations into resident treatment that echoed, in less publicized form, some of the same conditions exposed at Penhurst. Much of the original campus, including the cottages where the vaccine trials took place, still stands today across the Rockland County property. Some buildings converted to other municipal and private uses, others left simply closed and empty. Physical remnants of an institution that was once presented to the country as a model of progress, and that in the same decade conducted one of the most consequential medical trials in American history on children who had no voice in the decision at all. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with us through the full story of these 10 institutions. If you found this history as important as we did, please consider subscribing. We're covering more of America's hidden and forgotten places every week, and we'd love to have you along for the next one.